Hello and welcome to an emergency edition of Until Saturday. Uh, Chris, it feels like we've been doing a
Another
lot of
one.
these.
Another one.
It feels
Second
like we're
one
doing a
this
lot,
week.
and most of them are about one of the sexiest topics that we have ever encountered in this sport, and that is governance. We love
Oh, yeah.
governance, but this one's interesting, Chris, and I'll tell you, you will appreciate this analogy. Our friend Ari Wasserman, our co-host on this pod, will not appreciate it. But to me, Chris, and I will let you take this where you will. This feels a little bit like the end of episode 3 of the Star Wars trilogy. But the end of episode 3, which is Attack of the Clones, is it not?
No, episode 3 is
That's
Revenge
2.
of the Sith.
Revenge of the Sith, excuse me. But it feels a little bit like when Governor Palpatine takes over and becomes Chancellor Palpatine takes over and starts to become Emperor Palpatine and starts to grasp ultimate power. That's a little bit what this moment feels like. What we're talking about today is the SEC and the Big Ten forming what we will not refer to as the Alliance, although it is Alliance adjacent, except this one actually I think is real. Because we're not talking about holding hands like a game of Red Rover and trying to not let the big bad SEC sort of run things. What we're talking about here is shaping the future of the sport. And I think it's notable because nothing's happened yet. It's not clear exactly what this is going to look like, but you're going to have meeting rooms where the ACC and the Big 12 are literally locked out, and the SEC and the Big 10 are going to be in the room talking about where do we take this. There's a lot of arms to this. There's a lot of variables to this. But Chris, what did you make of this announcement that would have been unthinkable under previous leadership, but the sort of, I think our colleague, Nicole Auerbach, called it the thawing of the Cold War between the SEC and the Big Ten, and the relationship between Tony Petitti, new Big Ten commissioner, and Greg Sanky, who is now the longest tenured major conference commissioner?
Among the Power 5, yes.
Yes.
Power 4,
which he feels relatively new. But anyway, what did you make of this, Chris?
You know, nothing's actually happened yet. And my biggest thought about this is that it's a reaction to things that are coming down the pipeline and finally an acknowledgement that it needs to be proactive. Because really, for the last several years, based on various court cases, the NCAA has kind of initiated like conferences, you have power. You guys can run things for a bit here. And the only thing the conferences did with that power was tear each other apart through realignment for many years. And so then the NCAA was like, all right, we're going to do something. Charlie Baker comes forward with this Project D1 idea to help players make a lot more money, keep the NCAA together, opt into a new subdivision. That whole process just started. But now you have the SEC and Big Ten saying, look, we've gone through all these various meetings and everybody's looking to us. They're saying, what are you guys going to do? Because you guys have all the power, because you guys have all the money, because you guys have all the biggest and best teams now. And so it feels like they realize we need to start to chart a course forward, preparing for the resolution of this House lawsuit that could cost $3 billion plus. Court cases in the NLRB potentially ruling athletes, employees. Change has always been initiated onto college sports over the last number of years. And they have finally realized we need to be more proactive about something. And what that is, they don't know yet. Whether that's athlete compensation, whether that's within the NCAA or not, we don't know. It's very, very early. But it is a clear sign that the SEC and Big Ten realize we kind of have the power. We can direct where things go. We can influence everybody else. And now we're going to think about doing that.
Well, I think twofold. I think you sort of alluded to it. I think outside of governance, this goes back to one of the other things that people really love to talk about, and that's COVID. And I think during the COVID period, the conferences really figured out, nobody above us is doing anything. Like, if we're going to control the big picture issues in the sport, it has to be us. I remember during that time, the SEC and the Big Ten, specifically the SEC, I can't speak to the Big Ten explicitly. SEC is meeting every day. Like, hey, what are we doing? How do we develop this? What is the season going to look like? How are we taking care of our kids? There's 100 things to talk about during that period. And they would go weeks, months without hearing anything from the NCAA, who was supposedly the governing body. And I think that opened people's eyes to say, we are a lot leaner. We are a lot more proactive. And it seems like, fair or not, the appearance is that we care a lot more about the minutia of what's happening because we're on the ground. We're not in Indianapolis. We see what's happening, and we want to handle these big issues. Fast forward to today, we have all these existential issues, and that's kind of what you're seeing is, hey, we want our hand on the wheel. And I think some of this goes back to, Chris, to looking at the idea that the NCAA doesn't really make sense when you're talking about governance issues. I always talk about, Alabama football being governed by the same body as UMass field hockey does not make sense. And that is, I think here, this is a little bit more cut and dry than the Charlie Baker plan of this sort of new subdivision where sort of anybody can join. But I think it's the same idea. Is it leaner? We have to get leaner because we have to have groups that have at least something in common. The major conferences have something in common. And we already have some associations, some familiarity in the meeting room. Let's get together and let's try to figure out how we can put our weight behind getting things to where we want them to be because we're the most powerful ones. But let's have sort of a united front between the two biggest leagues.
Do you remember a number of years ago, Greg Sanky tweeted out a book that he had read called The Club?
He does that.
It was about the formation of the English Premier League. And I read that book after he tweeted about it. And it was remarkable how similar those situations were to college sports today, as in lower level teams preventing upper level teams from doing things related to the length of halftime and intermissions and names on jerseys and all kinds of stuff, like very minute stuff. And so what eventually the biggest clubs did was sort of create their own league on top of everything else. They stayed within the system, but they created their own league, essentially a new top tier. And that's what I keep coming back to. And that's what I keep thinking about is a possibility here. Not that they could break away and form their own playoff and do all these other things, but in terms of maybe how they want to compensate athletes, how they want to, how many coaches you want to have on staff. There are a lot of things that will need to be hammered out. And I was skeptical of this back during COVID, because if you remember, like you said, the conferences determined whether or not they played. It wasn't the NCAA. And the Big Ten was the second conference to cancel the season right after the MAC. And Greg Sankey was stunned by that. He was surprised by that at the time that happened. And so the concept of the Big Ten and the SEC at the time agreeing to anything felt like a long shot. They couldn't even agree whether or not to play football. And Greg Sankey very proudly said, we didn't cancel our season. We went forward and did this. But when Kevin Warren left for the Chicago Bears and Tony Petitti came in as commissioner, one of the top goals he knew was he had to have a better relationship with Greg Sankey. And they had to get on the same page, and they had to figure out what the future of college sports was going to be, because he knew that they were going to be the ones with the most power. So yeah, Nicole and Seth Emerson, I think too, wrote that story last year about how Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey had becoming a lot closer, and they weren't taking shots at each other at national championship parades like Greg Sankey did for Georgia that one year. So they are very much closer on the same page than they were back then. And it kind of comes back around to how far apart they were during COVID, then the alliance, now to this point where they realize, all right, we got to work together on something.
And I think it's important to lay out what this is not, Chris. And I think one thing, you alluded to it, this is not the break off. These two have we've been talking about this for years. Once these new TV deals were signed, once the Big 12 started getting stripped for parts, and then obviously once the Pac-12 fell apart among their own TV deals, the ACC has stripped back. It's been trending toward a Power 2 for some time. What is the number next year? It should be about $25 million more for the Big Ten than it's close. Then it's other than the SEC, than its closest competitor in terms of television revenue. So it's been the Power 2 for a while. This is not a break off. This is not, and I think Greg Sankey has said, in the lead up to this, in his own comments, that's not what they're trying to do here.
He's an NCAA guy.
Yeah, I don't think there's. I think
he was the head of the transformation committee. You know, he's not trying to destroy the NCAA.
He is a college sports lifer at a lot of different levels, where a lot of commissioners that have come in the sport are not. But Greg Sanky is. He spent his entire career in college sports, and I think that for all the talk of the so-called breakaway, there's not a ton of momentum like among college sports people to like do this. It's sort of like maybe we shift the power, maybe we get the rules in a more sustainable place where we like them more. But again, I think there is still, and especially this week, Chris, I've seen a lot of it. There is still this idea among fans that like the NCAA is this governing body that is sort of this mystery building in Indianapolis that is ruling over all of these schools that are more powerful, and the schools are going to rise up and take out the NCAA. The NCAA is the schools. I don't know how many times we have to say this. They can make the rules.
The Division I council is made up of, I want to say, 20 or like 40-ish people, but I think only like 4 or 5 or 6 are from like the Power 5
major conferences.
It's through all of Division I, and so it just makes things a lot slower. And one of the other parts of this that never comes up, and I'm never sure why. Remember a number of years ago when they created the Autonomy 5, that they were going to have their own power to try to do some things. They did cost of attendance, and like that was it. And that's what a lot of people around college sports have been saying for a while about the possibility of a breakaway or something else. Was like, you guys already have a lot of this power. I'm not sure why they haven't tried to do more out of the autonomy group, create their own rules. So now I guess the Big Ten and the SEC are going to create their own version on top of that and come up with some possible ideas. Maybe they take that back to the Autonomy 5. When you go to CFP meetings or when they have various commissioner meetings, there is a separate meeting with just the Power 5, Autonomy 5 commissioners, and they talk about autonomy type of things, but they've never done anything with it. And I've never really quite understood why. So now we're just going to have 2 conferences, I guess, try to kind of do the same thing. But the NCAA has granted them freedom to try new things. They just hadn't really done anything yet, which was strange.
Why do you think that is?
I think the lawsuits have scared everybody off from trying anything for a while. Not just Alston, but various stuff going through the pipeline, stuff that's been done before. I think they kind of waited to kind of see what they could or couldn't do. And now they realize the walls are closing in on them through a lot of different things. And now they have to do something on their own. And because the SEC and Big Ten have so much more money to pay off these settlements and lawsuits and pay players and pay coaches and all these things, that maybe they need to be the ones to make these decisions. So there's a CFP meeting next week, by the way, here in Dallas. That's going to be pretty eventful, I think, now with all the commissioners in town. Curious to see how that's going to go, but I'll be there.
Do they still do those at the airport Hyatt in the middle of DFW? So
yes, has to go I don't want to reveal where they do, but yes, they still do them at DFW. I've been to 10 to 15 of these. Most of them.
Been to a few back in the day. Yeah.
The last one, they came out of it very upset, and you could tell, but nobody would talk until you talk to people the next day and you realize the Pac-12 is holding up the move to a 5+7. And there was some disagreement over who became the new executive director of the CFP. Now they've got this on their plate. So
have fun, guys.
Never a dull day. College sports, go one day without an existential crisis, please.
Also go one day without creating a new committee of some kind.
Yeah, they're going to look for synergies and ways that they can create efficiencies through various things. I mean, look, they've said, look, this consulting group does not have power, does not have the ability to act. They're very much trying to not say, we're going to create our rules, we're going to do this. They're trying to very just gently dip their toes in the water here and say, we're going to talk about some possibility things and we might bring some other people in as we go about it. But we're just starting this. But I still think it's a very big deal to publicly announce this.
Yes.
In real life that, hey, we have to come up with something. And the original alliance was about slowing down change. It was a response to the SEC adding Texas and Oklahoma. It was not. That's why I was really upset about the way it was framed by SEC media last year on the playoff, was that the alliance didn't just happen. They did happen in a response to what SEC did, stunning everybody with Texas and Oklahoma. They tried to slow things down until Kevin Warren said, not actually, I'm going to go take USC and UCLA. And he wanted more than that. He didn't get more than that. And then it fell apart. This is very much, it feels like an alliance to be proactive and come up with changes. So it is a bit of a...
Like I said at the beginning, I think it's very notable that based on my reading of the situation here, and there's a lot of moving parts, this is not fully formed as they announced it today, but you're probably going to have a meeting room with, I'm guessing, 12 to 25 people of athletic directors, chancellors from these two leagues, and 0 of those people will be from the ACC and the Big 12 or the Pac-2, I guess. Are we still playing with the Pac-2 here?
I'm not considering them power or anything, but
yeah. So anyway,
George Kliavkoff still has a job for now.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think it's worth noting before we get out of here, Chris, that I think there is a world certainly in which this is the start of something bigger, where we do see some sort of formal break off. I don't think that's necessarily the intention, but I think it very clearly college football, I should say, not necessarily college sports. College football has been trending toward, okay, if you're not in the SEC, you're not in the Big Ten, you're not in the big leagues, but what does that look like formally in terms of playoff spots? In terms of, and this is as a fan of the sport, Chris, in terms of scheduling, are you never going to get to play these two teams? Is there going to be a world in which, or these two teams, these two leagues, if you're not in them, is there going to be a world in which the AFC, NFC sort of prophecy becomes reality where they figure out, why do we want to share any of this TV money? Why don't we just play all the games against each other and just split it with each other? Because there's going to be more value there. That's my sort of fear. I don't think that'd be great for the sport in any way. No. But I think that this is the first step where it could be something more formal, where the Big Ten and the SEC do embrace a role as the so-called big leagues, while whatever crumbs they sort of decide to throw the rest of the sport, I think, are up for debate. But it feels like that's where this could go. Do you agree? And what do you think this ends up looking like, or what do you think it might look like in the future?
First off, how do you think Florida State feels this morning? They're probably
a
little bit more panicked, right?
I don't want to derail the okay.
I just say that to say that yes, this is why they desperately want to get out of the ACC. This is why.
But I will say it's worth noting, because Florida State's a really interesting case. You hear a lot of saber rattling. Well, the Big Ten doesn't love their academics. Well, the SEC, is more interested in North Carolina and Virginia, and they already have Florida. I still am very skeptical, Chris, that when the rubber meets the road, and if Florida State, when they get out of the ACC, whether that's in 2035, 2028, or $500 million from a hedge fund later in 2024, whatever that is, right? I have a hard time believing that a brand like that, the Big Ten and the SEC, will look at it and say, nah, y'all go play somewhere else. I just don't. I get all the reasons why they wouldn't, but I think when it comes down to it, I am very skeptical that whatever this new world is, that Florida State will not be included in that.
To come back to your original point of what this looks like in the future, it is notable that the SEC and Big Ten just started their new TV deals. Those things go to like 2030, 2032 or whatever. So I think that is going to keep things a bit in place a bit longer. But also the CFP, they have not yet figured out what that looks like post 2026. That's what they're going to be talking about next week. That's still very much on the board for what it is, and why I have always said that if you're not the SEC or Big Ten, you want that 12-team deal, the next one, to go as far out into the future as you possibly can, just to save yourself spots. And it could end up like soccer. You look at the Champions League, the Premier League gets the most teams toward the end, and then there's like a couple of German teams and a couple of Spanish teams. And
shout out to Ajax.
But still, everybody still has an opportunity to get in. And so I think the CFP can still be the thing that keeps college football together, but they haven't really nailed that down yet. And so that needs to be done pretty soon. We'll see if they come together to some agreement moving forward. But I don't think we're going to have a SEC Big Ten breakaway their own playoff like soon. But I do think it's something down the road that is possible. I do think that the future that scares me the most is the idea that college football teams break away from the schools and become they like license the school identities and stuff like that, where they're basically almost like
minor
soccer
leagues.
Academies instead of universities. I don't think fans will like that. I think the facade of being a real college student still matters, but that's way down the road. This is the first step towards something that is clearly the SEC and Big Ten realizing they have to lead the charge to come up with something. It could be with the other power conferences. It could be with the other group of 5 conferences. But ultimately, you have to have the money to do whatever's coming up next. And we know the SEC and the Big Ten are the ones that have all the money.
Money talks, Chris. But we are done talking about this for now. I'm sure we'll see what this looks like, how this evolves, how this develops. But another day, another committee, another existential crisis. I feel like there's going to be a few more of these this offseason. The offseason of governance, Chris. I'm looking forward to so many governance stories over the next 9 months before we play football. I've been trying to preview a couple teams, some roster movement, all that stuff. It gets harder in a world where all of the rules are changing and all the jerseys are changing and all these things. College football is changing. It is a beautiful caterpillar burrowed in its cocoon. We'll see what kind of butterfly it bursts forth at some point. But right now, the sport is changing, and we will be there to cover it. Thank you for tuning into this emergency episode of Until Saturday. For Chris Vanini, I'm David Ubben. Thanks for tuning in.
Power to